So just to tell you a little bit, what I'm going to talk about a little bit is the way that early stage companies and venture capital have adapted a little bit to the changing environment in the sort of the Web 2.0 era. Now, I'll explain a little bit about what I mean by that and what the changes are, but then also, I think, importantly, what's the same. We'll talk about a couple of example companies. But if it's going to need to raise more capital later, and to kind of anticipate some of those issues about raising money for the company as it goes forward. So the main thing I wanted to talk about a little bit is about how the whole investment landscape for technology companies has changed in the kind of this Web 2.0 era. Now, I think there's been quite a bit of talk about Web 2.0, so I won't labour the point. But suffice it to say, from an investor's point of view, there are a few key things that have changed. The technology's changed, access to audiences has changed, and sources of revenue have changed. And those three things together have a compound effect, which is kind of more than the parts on their own. The cost of technology, I'm sure there's people in the audience know about 10 times as much as I do about any of this. And some of it's really kind of transparent. You've got open source software now in a way you hadn't before. You've got access to lots of free tools, etc., that you didn't have before. And so there's some great platforms on which to build stuff that weren't there before. I think what's probably also true is that in the first dot-com bubble, it coincided with the kind of millennium bug and all that. So the cost of good programmers was very, very high at that time, and there wasn't much ability to outsource to India and beyond. And I think competition has actually brought down prices for that kind of work, which for investors can make quite a big difference to how much it's going to cost them to get things through. So that's lowered the cost. That isn't all good for the people trying to do startup companies, because the downside is, for every possible market opportunity you might be interested in looking at it, there are probably several companies already shooting for that space. And that's really hard if you're the startup company, because all those other companies are knocking on all the same investors' doors and making the same case about how great what they want to do will be, and how distinct how they're going to do it is going to make them. So the result has been there's been a bit of a reaction from VCs. Right at the beginning of this whole Web 2.0 thing, VCs were quite proactive and quite keen. What we're seeing now, in my view, is a move to wait to see how user volumes are reflected in the progress of the startup. So the feedback we're getting from the people who will invest 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 million pounds in these things is you need to have many tens of thousands of users before you're likely to raise a big capital round. They want people to have voted with their mouse clicks. In terms of the way the audience has changed, there's some obvious metrics. We all know there's a heck of a lot more mobile phones around. We all know that a lot more people have internet access, and particularly always on broadband access. And frankly, they're sitting in front of it an awful lot more hours than they used to be. And that's all great. I think the other thing that's been particularly interesting for me, and it's made investors, again, a little bit wary, and that's something to take into account, is the fact that there's this thing called the tech crunch effect. And those of you might know there's a very widely read blog called TechCrunch that covers new innovations on the web. One of the disadvantages of that is, although it can get you a massive audience very quickly for your new innovation, an audience specifically very interested in trying everything, every single thing that gets out on TechCrunch will get around 20 to 30,000 downloads. It really doesn't matter how big it is or how peculiar it is. And that's just people trying it. And there was a time when if you could go to a VC and say, I've got 20,000 registered users, they would sort of be reaching for the checkbook. It's not quite like that now, because they want to understand why and how, and more particularly, are they still using it before they want to sort of pile in with some money. The sources of revenues is probably purely positive for the people wanting to do this kind of company. Back in the Web 1.0 era, there were advertising revenues that were great. But they were, A, somewhat artificial, because a lot of it was one .com advertising to the next .com. And therefore, when the thing started to come away from the wheels started to come off, then that had a particularly sort of vicious effect. Now Google has changed that. AdWords has changed that. But one thing we've learned, and through some of our companies looking to pursue advertising models, is the easy advertising revenue, when you've got low user numbers and a low user volume, is only if you've got a very conventional product that the advertising agents understand. They don't really want to engage with somebody who's got something completely brand new. If you've got a new piece of client software that's going to sit on your machine and show you adverts, you'd better be getting to several million minutes a day across the users before they're actually going to want to talk to you, because it's different. They've got to assess it, they've got to understand it, they've got to value it. So that's changed generally enormously for the positive, and I'm sure we're going to see a continual drive down the line to have advertising-based models. But it's not a complete no-brainer. What I think is probably more exciting, if a little more subtle, is